people are constantly raising the bar.
Sacrifices need to be made.
What would you guys say are your biggest weaknesses?
You or your enemy right now?
Is success a lie?
Just a fucking podcast.
That I really, really want to get your opinion on. Basically, so this is something that I'm trying to figure out myself. So I interviewed someone a while ago on, and are we okay for time? Because I know I won't go much longer than this.
Sure.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, no, sure.
Yeah.
Let's do it, man.
So I interviewed someone a while ago on, you might have read the research, they're at AUT, Dr. Catherine Crofts. They do research on basically the interactions between keto and diabetes, and I might summarize the research wrong here, but it's like the sort of, if you have a massively high glycemic load now, which for those listening, I probably can't explain that well, but basically if you understand the concept of volume and weightlifting, it's kind of like load is kind of similar to volume and weightlifting. Basically total amount of sugar, not sugar, like carbohydrates, and then that increases the higher glycemic they are. Is that generally correct?
Yeah, so you can just think about it as the amount of glucose that's probably going to be coming into the system via the diet, which we get kind of breaking down carbohydrate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Sweet. Oh, that makes a lot more sense. And then, in terms of that, her theory was sort of, if we have a chronically high glycemic load, even if you're a lean individual who has good blood glucose control, etc., do you, from what the conversations you've had, your knowledge, etc., how much would you agree with that, where it's like, or from what we know, can even begin to agree with it? To agree with it, like, if it's going to cause diabetes down the road, or any negative health implications, or if it's even an issue, or on the other end of the spectrum, how much is it okay? I have a very vested interest in this just because of my current diet. For example, I eat like 4,500 calories a day. I weigh 72 kilos. Ridiculous. Like, I track pretty meticulously, so I don't think like, I used to be coached by Steve Hall, and he was like, what? Nah, like, can't be right. And then and I eat a shit ton of sugar, like a metric fuck ton. Like, I'd be embarrassed to say how much. I'll type it in chat, like, how much we're generally talking. Like, this is like on the low end, that might be on the high end. Like, that might be, those numbers might be wrong, but yeah, of sugar per day. So I'm having roughly 600 grams carbs, maybe more, 700. I keep my fats, they flow, just whatever, just so I can actually adhere. So in terms of that, in the situation where it's like someone like myself or people in general, how much do you agree with that sort of thing where it's like, even if you have good blood glucose control, you're going to fuck your shit up down the road by having that amount of glycemic load, etc.? What are your general thoughts?
Yeah, so there's probably two things that I'll kind of distinguish between. So first, if we're talking about glycemic load, that could be covering the amount of carbohydrate coming into the diet. Let's presume that's what they were talking about. That's distinct from, again, we could have a separate question in a moment. We'll address sugar specifically of, is it okay to have this many grams of sugar per day? So they're like two different questions. So with the where I would be on, does a relatively moderate to high intake of carbohydrate lead to development of type 2 diabetes? Is that kind of premise that we're putting forth?
I would say, moderately high, not even,
so
like, my levels shouldn't think of as like dangerously ridiculous.
So for me, we should first acknowledge that development of insulin resistance, of pre-diabetes, of type 2 diabetes is, again, one of these multifactorial things that many things tie into play. I think it's inaccurate and kind of dangerous to think of it as a carbohydrate-driven disease, in that if you eat carbohydrates, you develop these things. Yeah. Instead, I think it's kind of it's inaccurately kind of trying to reverse engineer the problem, in that once you have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, yes, you are less, quote unquote, tolerant of carbohydrate. Yeah. So for a certain amount of carbohydrates you take in, you will not be able to dispose of that glucose into a cell as effectively. You'll get higher outputs of insulin, and you're generally not able to tolerate that or you're not able to bring blood glucose back down to a normal level in the usual time frame that we would have. So this is where if you see they have a high glucose excursion after a meal, what's termed. So either their blood glucose goes higher and or stays higher for longer. That's because they're not able effectively to bring it back down by putting that glucose into a cell. Right. Those things do happen when someone is insulin resistant or type 2 diabetes. So I think someone can make a fair case that in the management of those issues, going lower to moderate on carbohydrate intake is probably a good idea. Now, I don't think there's any evidence to show that reverses or puts diabetes into remission. That's what we're still trying to work out. Yeah. So far, I think there's only one dietary intervention that has shown to actually have remission of diabetes in terms of improving the function of beta cells in the pancreas where we secrete insulin. Right. And that was a very low calorie formula diet, 800 calories a day for 12 weeks, I think it was. That was done by Wright out there in the UK. What was
the sort of level of if you happen to know, what was the level of remission? Or was it full or was it partial?
So they had they stratified it out based on how much weight people had lost. Okay. So people that lost more than 15 kilos during the intervention, I think 80-something% of them were classified as having remission. Yeah. For people who lost less, it was a bit less than that. Yeah. So I think I can't remember the average, but maybe around 40%-ish of the people that did that. Yeah. And so in this study, they classified remission as their hemoglobin A1C, which is think of it as a 3-month marker of blood glucose. Hemoglobin A1C was less than 6.5 for a period of more than 2 months whilst having no diabetic medication as well. And so that's the kind of only intervention I've seen to actually cause this kind of improvement in beta cell function. So in terms of what's causing insulin resistance and what's causing type 2 diabetes, again, there's many things outside of just carbohydrates, and probably that are probably more in line. I think total energy that's coming into the system. We can look at, you can see things like how even high amounts of fatty acids in the bloodstream, development of high amount of adiposity, particularly visceral adiposity, might be implicated there. So there's genetics, there's all these various factors. So to think as simplistically as if you eat anything that's not a low carb diet, you'll develop insulin resistance. And I'm sure she wasn't probably saying that, but that line of thinking is quite common for people. Right. Think, diabetes or insulin resistance is driven just by someone eating carbohydrates, so don't eat carbohydrates and it doesn't develop. I just don't think that's accurate. Yeah. Where I probably would agree is having some control of the glycemic load in people that already have, say, established insulin resistance probably is beneficial just for managing sense that the system, you're going to require less insulin to manage that. Right. But again, it's not required, right? So even we've seen people improve symptoms in diabetes that have been on high carbohydrate diets. So there's ones, particularly if you look at any of the vegetarian or vegan interventions, relatively the percentage of those calories are mainly carbohydrate, and you can see improvements in diet or in symptoms. So it's not just think of it as just carbohydrate driven.
Right. Yeah, that's insanely interesting to me. Do you think? So.
And I should probably also address the sugar question in a moment as well. Wait.
Before we address that, something that I sort of thought about a lot. Do you think would you, from what you know, could you sort of guesstimate towards two major factors? One being total calorie driven or general higher energy expenditure. I mean energy intake, and then that leading to excess fat, and then maybe that combined with a lack of exercise, and then the mechanism. This is total guess, but it's sort of what I'd think to be logical. Then the mechanism to that being sort of the fact that if you're not exercising, there's no point for glycogen to deplete. There's no point for glucose to go and actually convert to glycogen. So do you feel like that can, if we're in that stage where we're always full of glycogen, because 1, excess adiposity, 2, never depleting it, always full, no reason for glucose to actually convert to glycogen. Would that be thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think a chronic hypercaloric diet and inactivity are both are kind of both shown to reduce insulin sensitivity over time. So you're becoming more insulin resistant by doing that. And so the way to maintain some insulin sensitivity is through being regularly physically active.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is from just getting the muscle moving. Some of it could be kind of your idea of here, you're actually using carbohydrate more often, and you're not having, you're actually just being able to oxidize carbohydrate at different time points.
Right.
But I think, inactivity or sedentary behavior, as well as sustained overfeeding or overnutrition, hypercaloric diet, those things both will decrease insulin sensitivity, or in other words, increase insulin resistance. So yeah, both of those are kind of implicated in that, and can be two of the drivers. But like I said, it kind of gets
complex. Yeah. We can't with anything in this, we cannot pin it down to any X, Y, or Z. But one thing that we commonly pin it down to, sugar. What is the general, from what you know, what's the general thoughts?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So the kind of question we're trying to get to the root of is, well, how much sugar is too much sugar, right? So you know that sugar is probably not a good idea to have a lot of it in the diet, or too much in the diet, or an excessive amount. All these things we see in guidelines. The question is, what is excessive amount? And there's probably the thing that makes this difficult is because there's many things that would influence what's an adequate amount of sugar to have in the diet.
Right.
So I think quite clearly things we can dismiss on both ends of the spectrum. One, the idea that having any sugar in the diet is bad.
Yeah.
That's just quite clearly not the case. We can include some amount of sugar in the diet and still be perfectly healthy. This is not problematic. There are certain cases where you can think that almost would be necessary, right?
Yeah.
Someone goes hypoglycemic, we're going to give them some sugar. Someone that competes in elite level sport, and at halftime they have a Gatorade, not really going to be a problem, right? So there's many cases where we know sugar doesn't need to be kept to zero. There is probably an upper range where sugar becomes so predominant in the diet that it has some issues. Now, first there's the indirect issues. People that have a lot of sugar in the diet that we typically think of, therefore they have a bad diet and they overeat, is high amounts of that sugar being part of this matrix of food that drives hyperpalatability. So they over-consume. So sugar can be something that's over-consuming. I think probably what we're getting to is the kind of that gray area in the middle of how much of sugar can be in the diet in the context of an overall relatively healthy diet that is not leading to some over-consumed calories. And that becomes difficult. So we have to kind of think of, well, first, is it replacing any other nutrients that would be of benefit? And that's probably the biggest issue with really high sugar intakes. So if you're filling up a large amount of your calories with sugar, even if that's sticking to a certain number of calories, the more sugar that's proportioned in a diet, the more or the less of other things that are beneficial for you that you can include. So there's less room for more nutrient-dense foods that give you more micronutrition or give you polyphenols or all these things that do us good. So that's one potential issue. The kind of counter that as well, what if I include enough vegetables and stuff like that? How much is too much then? Then the next thing is, well, is there any point at which when we go beyond that amount of sugar that it has these negative acute impacts we see on things like health of the endothelial lining of blood vessels or glycation of certain proteins and all these things you hear about. And that's really hard to get to. So as a more general heuristic, it's probably, we could say, the more active someone is, the more muscle mass they have, probably the younger they are. And then in the context of their overall diet being good, then in the context of those things, they can probably have relatively more sugar than someone else. What the exact amount per day is, I don't know. I don't know how we go about working that out. You might see general recommendations for like 10% of your calorie intake, right? Keep it to that. But again, if it goes to 9% or 11%, is there any difference? So there's probably no one figure.
Do you feel like, okay, for instance, if we take an individual with like 200 grams of sugar, 300 grams of sugar, in a diet of like 600 grams of carbs, do you think, like, is that kind of getting to the point where it's like risky?
The answer is I don't know, right? So it depends. Like, so if that person is getting through like a ton of like glucose oxidation, maybe they're doing a ton of activity every day, and that maybe you could make a case that's fine, and presuming that their overall diet then includes plenty of the other stuff that's just good for health. So they're not have a suboptimal intake of, say, lots of fiber, fruits and vegetables, and all that other good stuff.
Do you think
in that case it'd be difficult? I mean, if they're looking at blood markers and that's all perfectly fine,
like blood glucose, do you think if they measured that, it might be a decent?
Yes, like if they're getting a fasting glucose, fasting insulin, you could look at like an oral glucose tolerance test, which is basically you give like a standardized amount of like 75 grams of glucose, look at what their postprandial glucose response is for a couple of hours.
So fasting and then do that?
So yeah, there'd be two separate tests.
Okay.
And so that would be more informative, because someone can essentially become pre-diabetic and have normal fasting glucose, but they just have glucose intolerance where their postprandial response goes crazy.
Right. Yeah.
Similarly, someone else have a really high fasting glucose, but their postprandial response is kind of okay. So there's these kind of two different forms that we can see of pre-diabetes, where someone has either high fasting glucose or has like poor glucose tolerance after a glucose challenge.
Right.
So I mean, if all that stuff is fine, then like that means like they're metabolically healthy, all seems good with their health, they're active, and they're getting all that good stuff in. Like, someone then has to have the burden to show it's doing something bad, right? So the answer is I don't know, but you could probably the counterpoint someone would say is, well, if you reduce that by a certain amount, could you have a better quality diet that would lead to better health?
Yeah, that's the thing.
I don't know. It kind of depends what the person is doing as well. And then it probably, I think the time course might matter too. So this is something I don't have really any data for, but it makes some sense to me that if someone is, say, chronically having like 600 grams of carbs, 200 grams of sugar every single day for a very long period of time, then that, like, I think there is some reason to suggest that might not be a good strategy for health in the long term. That just even punctuating that with periods of lower carbohydrate intake, fasting, like any of these things, chronically at this super high level all the time, where this is chronically high glycemic load continually, that makes some sense to me. But that'd be fairly easy to break up with either phases or even days where the carbohydrate doesn't go that high. But yeah, it's really hard to quantify over what time scale some of that stuff would happen and how much of a problem it is. And but yeah, that's kind of my off the top of the head.
I think
thoughts
what's interesting is, like in bodybuilding, right, we'll go on massive long bulks, and then, like, if you take my case, I eat a shit ton of sugar and I am chronically bulking, right? So I did one cut and it was almost an accident. Like, I went from 72 kilos to 66 by basically sneezing, and then and then I think it's quite interesting because I walk a shit ton. Like, I'd be definitely interested in doing some experiments myself in terms of blood glucose, etc., and seeing those sort of things, and kind of trying to figure out
so I mean,
my responses
for me, it's kind of like probably getting at a point of the whole concept people talk about with like metabolic flexibility, of like kind of understanding what you mean by that, of being able to oxidize both carbohydrate and fat at the appropriate times, and to be able to move between each of those fuel substrates as needed. So one of the things that happens if you say chronically eat a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet is not in any pathological way, but you get this transient insulin resistance where during that time while you're in ketosis, your say your muscle cells are essentially insulin resistant. And this makes sense because you have very limited amount of glucose in your system. What glucose you do have, you're going to try and spare for getting up to the brain, which will still use some amount of glucose, even in a ketogenic state. And so you don't want other cells in the periphery taking up that glucose, so they become essentially insulin resistant. So at that time point, you're more metabolically inflexible because you're not actually able to use carbohydrate as well. And we see this in a lot of sport nutrition research as well. If someone goes on like a low carb, high fat diet for a number of days, even when you refeed them with carbohydrate, they seem less able to tap into that glycogen and break down glycogen and use in exercise. So they're less able to use that carbohydrate. Therefore, they're metabolically inflexible in that direction. So you could probably make a fair case in, well, then maybe the opposite end happens in the case you just outlined. If someone's chronically eating just high carbohydrates, high carb meals all the time, really high load of carbohydrates, high load of sugar chronically, especially in a surplus, that's probably not the best for maybe insulin sensitivity in the long term, and could be seen as impacting their ability to oxidize fat more. So could you break that up by having certain days where you punctuate with lower calorie intakes and then also lower carbohydrate intakes? That sounds like a reasonable strategy to me if we're looking purely at metabolic health in the long term. Now, if someone's goal is just hypertrophy, it's kind of a different conversation. But on metabolic health, it makes sense to me that might be something worth doing, to break that up with periods of lower energy and lower carbohydrate intakes at certain periods.
Yeah, because it's a fascinating conversation to me, because it's like there's so many variables, and it's like they obviously interact, and it's like we know with all this we can't just say X is bad. Like in context, X might be bad sometimes. But it's like, yeah, it's mind-blowingly fascinating, because we've got the variable of chasing hypertrophy and like the sort of mechanisms that uses, and then it's an interesting one. But I definitely think I agree. It's like it's probably not a bad idea if I can still adhere. When we're talking about ton of carbohydrate intake, I don't know if we've been a little cryptic. It's like, I think it'd probably be a good idea for me to reduce it if I can still adhere. But then it's like personal goals. My only goal in terms of being an athlete is like hypertrophy. That's all I give a shit about. It's a mind-blowing conversation to me. I don't want to keep you for too much longer, because we've talked for like 2 hours now. And
no, it's all good, man. I find this stuff fascinating too.
Same.
And I think it's just it's really interesting. But it just, again, a lot of it is just maybe theoretical, but I think it makes sense to me if we're trying to, again, from a metabolic health standpoint, I don't think chronically high hypercaloric diet with tons of carbohydrate every day for a long period of time necessarily makes the most sense. So they have to punctuate that up. It actually reminds me of someone was discussing fasting before a few years ago on like a Facebook thread. I think with my friend Adam. And do you know Bojan Kostevsky?
No.
He's a medical doctor. I think he's a Swedish cool guy. Has written some good stuff in fitness area. But he said they were talking about like fasting and using like periods of fasting during the middle of like a gaining phase for some of these reasons that suggested like bringing back some sensitivity. And he said he referred to fasting is the refeeding of gaining phases. So to think of the same way of where you punctuate a refeeding period during dieting to kind of gain back some of that sensitivity when you're overfeeding chronically. Maybe now and again having they like say a fasting day, but you could also think of that as a low calorie, low carb day as well. To again like punctuate it there in the middle of continued gaining. Because you see quite reliably as someone gains more and more weight over time in the gaining phase, particularly because of the high calories, and also maybe because some of it is to do with the increase in fat gain too. You will see decreased insulin sensitivity, and then you can plausibly say, well, does that impact your ability to partition more kind of fuel to muscle, or to actually build more muscle the longer you go through a gaining phase? Maybe. But yeah, from a metabolic perspective, to me, that's where it's kind of about being, just give your body periods of time where you're actually having to tap into oxidizing more fat and less carbohydrate at certain time point, to maintain some of that metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, I try. I think that's insanely fascinating, because it's like, I thought recently about, many of us in fitness will have the okay, so I'll be blunt about it. People say we don't have camps, but people generally in fitness tend towards having camps. It's not a good way to think, but yeah, like I would say a lot of us, I'm definitely currently, in terms of how I train, prescribed to a lot of what Revive Stronger, Renaissance periodization, what they believe in terms of training, that basically ends up having mesocycles. And I've thought a lot about having, because myself, I'm one of the, I would say, rare individuals who, I get to the point where I'm like, fuck, I hate eating, hate it, fuck it, don't want to eat a single more thing. Nothing appeals to me at a certain point, which is obviously like that occurs. And I've commonly thought about, for my dietary adherence, and then also during a period like a deload, when I'm not like, when I'm not really pushing volume up, so muscle protein breakdown isn't as high, the need for calories, I have a feel like, I don't see why we can't do, not a period of fat loss, but it's, I guess, like that sort of period. It's like, I guess there's going to be, if we actually try and lose fat in that period, I guess it's just a ton of like water weight and glycogen loss and then fat loss. So I guess that's the main reason for that. And then we have to actually get back, so it's like we're switching. It's like we're going one direction than the other, so it's kind of pointless. But yeah,
you could even punctuate like 1 day of lower calorie, low carb eating. Now and again, that could be still fit in with the overall context of you're still in a gaining phase. On the average of that week, you're still in a surplus.
Right.
And you could set up in a way that it doesn't impact your training. And then that way, you're still having at least these certain days where you're not constantly in this postprandial state where you're only dealing with high amounts of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So things that might be useful.
Yeah,
again, that'd be
interesting. It'd be an interesting area to have some research in, and like, and sort of see, or even like apply it anecdotally and sort of see some like case studies. Like, that would be really fucking cool, because it's like, I mean, research to me is still so complex and still like mind-blowingly like, wow. And I can't even comprehend how to begin to do it yet. Obviously, I was in my undergrad. But it's like, it'd be fascinating to see that, because it's like we have diet breaks now. We have people like Jackson Pios like sort of speaking about that and thinking about that and thinking about the, like, I can't imagine how people did it without it. Like, or just how would you go like how you would just go through basically a cut without doing that, especially like comp prep, or like mainly just comp prep. And it's like, I don't see why we don't have the same thing. Like, we have mini cuts, like Steve Hall and co. Quite fond of mini cuts. I mean, I don't think I know enough to agree yet, but I agree. And it seems to work well, and it seems to sort of prolong the gaining phase, which I think is sort of along the same lines, but it's like a different period, right? It's like how we don't really think 1 to 2 day refeeds are that useful comparatively to like a 1 or 2 week diet break. It's just, I guess,
right, yeah. And I mean, it all just becomes, those strategies just become a function of what's the overall strategy,
right.
Because those mini cuts to me seem to be a function of how the longer period of the gaining phase is set up. So the types of rates of weight gain that, say, Steve or Mike Israel or so on seem to suggest means that, yeah, that makes sense. Now and again, let's put in these kind of periods of a few weeks of mini cuts, bring body fat back down, let's return back to the gaining phase. Whereas you could contrast that with, let's say, like a 3DMJ gaintaining phase,
Yeah.
where you're not really doing regular mini cuts on the same frequency as that, but you're also not going with the increases in weight week to week at the same rate either. So it's a much slower, gradual, like very gradual drift in weight upwards over many, many months. So the gaining phase lasts much longer without being punctuated by these mini cuts. But it's not saying one is necessarily better than the other. Just the inclusion of mini cuts is a function of how fast we're going to gain per week in that phase. And so then the interesting question becomes, well, over the course of a year, does one of those strategies give more benefit than the other? And that's kind of where, I guess,
that's what we can't
you have to kind
answer
of
yet.
pick one side of the fence and kind of go with what everything is best. So nothing can be viewed in isolation of how to use them. It's like, well, what you're doing in the larger term, and then you can work back from that.
Yeah, I cannot wait till the day that I can think about things in that sort of depth and take like these already complex things and distill them down like that. Like that is like, damn, that's like, because very rarely in these conversations comes up something that's like I've never even thought about before and never even glimmered through my mind. Obviously, there's a lot of shit that I've never thought through fully all the time, and like that's what we talked about before. It's like always mind blowing all the time, but it's like there's very few things where it's like holy shit. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing. I think. Yeah.
Cool.
I think we should probably finish off, but so there is a few random questions I think it would be interesting to ask. In terms of your thought process, is there any specific resources, people that you've met online, or other people can go out and reach out to, or books, or podcasts, whatever, that sort of you would say elevated you to the next level, sort of intellectually, or made you think at a sort of higher level, or sort of like, did you have any like Quake books, stuff like that?
So in terms of how I think about things, and so there's probably two elements of that, is probably just generally, and then also the idea of scientific thinking is something I talk about quite regularly. And that the thing to understand about critical thinking and scientific thinking is it's inherently opposed to our natural inclination of how to think. That's why we have this thing called science, because humans are full of bias and cognitive traps that we fall into. And so we have to come up with a system that removes the human from decision making. So it's something that has to be learned over time. So there's probably a few things. So what I find quite useful for how to think about stuff is actually listening to a lot of ideas that come from outside of nutrition and fitness and health specifically, and then allowing what I do know about those things to kind of cross-pollinate in some way. Trying to think of sources that I generally listen to. So I think the book that I mentioned to you off air, Dan Dennett's book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, is a really great thing along that lines that has kind of helped me think through stuff. I think reading stuff by Carl Sagan is really useful, of just how we should view the world, how we should think about science in general. Some of the podcasts I listen to tend to be in like the general science area. Sean Carroll is a physicist. He has a great podcast called Mindscape. What else? I tend to read and listen to quite a bit of Sam Harris, which I realize is not everyone's cup of tea. I like Sam Harris quite a bit. Other kind of book, a lot of it then is just through conversations with some friends where we like kick around different ideas and think through stuff. Trying to read some types of philosophy. I find Stoic philosophy quite interesting to read.
Have you read any of Ryan Holiday's books?
I've read quite a few of them. So I've read.
This will be
Ego's the Enemy.
Yeah. Do you know? I don't know if you recognize this, but can you see that? I don't know if you can even see.
Oh, I can see it.
Yeah, it's
I can just.
It's literally that. I'll see if I'll regret that in 10 years. For those who obviously aren't on the call, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know. I have no clue. Tattoos are very subjective. I have a tattoo of the statue from Ego is the Enemy, and yeah, that was sort of that because man, that book fucking shook it for me. Is there anything?
Yeah.
Was there anything else there?
I think that's quite a bulk of it, and then just trying to think about concept of what kind of science is. So I'm trying to think of a couple of books. One book that I recommend to a lot of people is a book by this lady Annie Duke, who is a Duke, who is a former professional poker player, and she wrote a book called Thinking in Bets, and it does a really good job of showing how most humans don't ever get to grips with the skill of thinking and probabilities, and thinking that way is really, really useful because that helps our decision making all across life. And so most people will think either something does happen, it doesn't happen, or it might happen. So they think in 3 probabilities: 0, 100, or 50%. Whereas really, as we know, very rarely something is 100 or 0%. That we don't really know for sure. And most things slide along that spectrum of anywhere in between that. And understanding where that is allows us to make better decisions. So an example that she gave before was, or I've heard it either in the book or on a podcast, was if you think about flying, and if someone is worried about the plane crashing, right? Well, they're thinking, well, the plane might get there safely or it might not, right? So if you think of it that way, then you can get really worried. Whereas if you understand all the factors that tie into the probabilistically what's the likelihood of this plane going to crash is so infinitely small that then you don't need to worry.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think of probabilities, you can't make that decision, and similar. So that's a really good book. There's one other that I was going to say there. On line of thinking. A lady that was on my podcast before, her name is Carol Tavares. She wrote a book, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. And it's just an amazing book about cognitive dissonance and other cognitive biases and how we can, the way we fool ourselves about how we think. So those 2 are really good books. So that's a kind of collection of some stuff from, I guess, outside of nutrition and fitness. So those things kind of shape a lot of what I think about stuff.
Yeah, they'd sound, I would say, right up my alley. Very, very, very like the kind of shit where it's like, I don't know. I think those kind of things have shaped my sort of thinking of how to phrase this. I guess I'll say political views, or the beginnings of my thoughts around fitness and nutrition and general population health. I think it formed the start of that, but then I think, that's a weird sort of tangent to put on there, but I think but I think those, I'm probably going to read a few of those books and give them a go. The other question that I
just thought of before going, because I mentioned earlier about trying to see things from other people's perspectives and how it might explain how they got to that point or why they hold certain political views. There's a great book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind.
Oh, yeah, I'm reading it right now. It was recommended by Lennon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right then, yeah.
Yeah.
Good choice.
Yeah. It's so far so good.
He has a good book list, so if you follow his book list.
He always seems to be
very
dug in a book, and he posts. Did you see his post the other day? It's him at a bench, and in the corner there's these little hashtags. Lyndon's so fucking crack up. It's like these little hashtags. It's like millennial. What was it? It was like millennial. Basically displays of being in the in group. It's funny, very, very funny.
Oh yeah, very good.
He's a character, yeah. And so, are we all good for time? I know we've gone like crazy long.
Yeah, I got another like 5 minutes if,
Cool.
if
Yeah,
not
yeah.
questions.
There's no. I'll leave this question because it can go down a long ass rabbit hole, and we've gone down like 20,000 rabbit holes. Yeah. So, where can people find you? Do you have any products coming out? Do you have anything in specific? Obviously, in terms of the everything you create, I would 100% get behind it. So if the listeners trust what I say, obviously go do it. But where can people find you, Danny?
Probably the best place is just go to sigmanutrition.com. Everything should be there. If they want to check out the podcast, then it's just Sigma Nutrition Radio on any podcast app that they can find. And yeah, if they're looking for me on social media, just pop in my name. It should be relatively easy to find. Instagram is just Danny Lennon _Sigma. And yeah, on any of those places, they should be able to find out more information.
So this next part of the conversation basically revolves around, it's quite broad, sort of management of obesity. Basically, it's the conversation we had off air. I've checked with Danny. It's fine to keep this in because I thought it was such a fascinating conversation. This is the thing that commonly happens. You'll have such a fascinating conversation off air as well as on air. So I thought I would try and get this bit in here. So yeah, enjoy.
Someone brought up like, what do we do about the obesity epidemic?
Right.
And so I was like, number one, no idea. But two, if there was, I suspect it would have to be a moving away from an idea of personal responsibility of the individual, because there's all these other factors that are driving obesity that are socioeconomic. And so that might have to be more of a kind of top-down solution. But I said, if we start getting into this discussion, it gets political very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And particularly because some of the other speakers are from the States, they have it even worse because it can get political and emotional very
real quick
when you start talking. I didn't want to get too far into it in terms of me offering like, this is the solution, because I just don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, it's too complex to be solved in a conversation, I'd say.
Right. And plus, it's not like I have a passing interest in it, but public health nutrition is a very different thing from nutritional physiology and biochemistry and stuff. Yeah. And particularly when you start getting to policy change of like at a governmental level, how much regulation industry is good or not, what changes would actually work. Because like, but they're the types of conversations that can get political. So it's hard. They're the ones I find hardest in terms of like the podcast discussing, because it gets into much less and physiology perspective, and it much gets into like politics, and
it's like
that can
when
get emotional for people.
What's that guy? Jamie Oliver, when he was saying sugar tax, it's like it just looks a bit ridiculous, because it's kind of like, hey, you don't really like. It's just like, yeah, like he knows how to make nice tasting food, and maybe some nutritional advice, but it's like, mate, like, it's just maybe it was just jumping on the bandwagon because people would get on it, and maybe that'd be a good tool for fame.
I think a lot of it is they're trying to be seen to be doing something, and there's no other thing that looks obvious apart from that. that to me, if there was going to be some regulation that would help, the distinction between regulating at like a consumer level, but is probably going to be problematic, because like something like a sugar tax kind of hits people in those lowest socioeconomic classes anyway, and it's probably not the behavior. But what you could probably do is look at like, what top-down interventions could you put in place at a food industry level that might have knock-on effects of the types of foods that's being produced, or the likely breakdown of those. So then you're not really taking away people's choice of what they eat, but things are typically consuming, maybe you're altering the total caloric intake of the average diet by those means. Now, whether that would work or not, I don't know. But saying to someone, we get out the obesity epidemic through educating people about food choices, or through people assuming personal responsibility, just is never going to work when you look at where it's most concentrated.
That's something that I think it's very, like, I've been, like, I would say, really interested in that sort of thing for quite a while now, and it's like, obviously I have zero nutritional knowledge comparatively. It's like, but it's definitely like, we look at all these culprits and we blame all these culprits, and then Yeah, it's like I used to definitely be on the bandwagon of like, oh, everyone should just not be so lazy and just have some self discipline. But it's like, fuck. Like then you see the patients that I see at my clinic. I'm not a podiatrist yet. I'm at a placement, and we have like an AUT like student clinic, and it's like,
Cool.
mate, they've got so much shit to deal with. It's like they don't have. Not everyone can pretend to be a bodybuilder. It's like
Yeah.
some of us can live that life, but it's like most people don't give a fuck about this stuff nearly as much as most of us do.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
just
Yeah.
like,
And yeah, man, it's just some people just don't have the luxury of even thinking about some of these things. Joe, when you look at like associationally, it's super clear of like for if you draw a graph from like socioeconomic deprivation and the amount of rates of obesity or chronic disease, it's basically just like a linear graph between them. If you look at difference in life expectancy between neighborhoods in the same city that are just different in terms of socioeconomic class, dramatically different. And when you think of the food choices that are available to them, again, it's not a case of you're choosing to eat bad or have this lifestyle. It's got like super high chronic stress, not available of good quality foods, kind of this massive inequality in wealth. And like all those things tie into driving health and obesity that are not at the level of personal responsibility.
yeah. It's like we have we had one Krispy Kreme in New Zealand, and it was placed in Manukau, which is like one of the lowest socioeconomic areas in Auckland. And it was just like, for fuck's sake, like obviously that's a business move. It's just kind of like,
you see that in this has been mapped in quite a few westernized countries where fast food restaurants, if you look at their density in certain areas, and again you mapped it on with socioeconomic class of that area, you see again a linear line of the more socially deprived an area is, the greater density of those places there are, and less supermarkets, because supermarkets don't want to go in there. So now you have less opportunity for cheap fruit and vegetables, and what is there is fast food restaurants. And then as wealth increases, you get the kind of reverse flipped around.
right.
And so saying this, well, it's up to someone, why don't they just like catch a bus to a different area of town to buy food? It's that's like delusional. It's so far removed from the real world. Like that doesn't make sense. Or telling people in these areas, oh, well, if you go and shop at a farmer's market, you'll be okay. So what planet are you living on?
It's so multifactorial that it's just like, okay, if we add that factor of having to take a fucking bus, it's like we can try and like we can pretend it's down to things like just sugar, but it's like, okay, if that was the case, then if we just removed sugar from everyone's diet, it's like, would that fucking solve it? Like maybe it might help a little, but it's like, fuck, like
that's the point.
Yeah, it's
with obesity stuff, man. That's why like these conversations around like how much carbs or how much fat we should have, it's like it's kind of missing the center of the bullseye of like, you can talk about them when we're at a level of people are already invested in nutrition and interested to learn, and they're like, well, I feel a bit better from eating a ketogenic diet or whatever. It's like that's so irrelevant to the conversation of like population-wide health and obesity. It's like it doesn't matter. Those things don't matter. Like they're just general basics that we don't have in place. And just the food environment is
like, do you see this? Like
I don't see it being.
It scares the shit out of me. It's like fuck. Like
I'm just very pessimistic about it. I just don't see how. But again, then some people are like working on like what policies and solutions we could put in place. So they might have more faith than me, but I just don't see how when we have like this the current food environment, and essentially it's being driven by actually the good side of capitalism, I guess, right? Of like we can now produce things very cheaply, cost efficiently, within super close distance to people as much as possible. But again, that's what the market's supposed to be doing. So how do you reverse out of that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's like there's so many things stacked, and it's just like I don't know. Like, you know how people have that whole tinfoil hat thing, blah blah 9/11 blah blah, and then they'll have their like, oh, the government's out to get us, and then it's like this is the one time where it's kind of like fuck. Like I kind of feel like the corporations, the government, all that kind of like they're just capitalizing on it. I kind of feel. Would you like?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what big corporations are going to do. So that's why I think the solution would have to be some sort of top down to
yeah,
control something that's going on there. What,
mm.
I don't know, or what scope they would have to do it.
It's very, very
But
difficult.
it's really tricky to work out.
Yeah,
Um,
because it's like if we
so
just
yeah,
educate everyone, they'll just retain fucking 10% of it, and then it's like is that
yeah. The
it?
problem isn't education.
Yeah,
Like those areas, like ask. So if you go and like go to any place where take 100 people that have obesity
mm.
and like ask all of them, do they think fruit and vegetables are good for you? Like what percentage will say yes? Like it's not an education thing really. Or do you think having like 5 donuts a day is bad? Like most of
It's
my
like
stats are right,
I don't know
you
one
know?
fucking person who would be like,
Yeah.
it's
So
debatable. Like I think only the only time when someone would say it's debatable is someone like myself, where maybe like a year ago I'd be like, or even somewhat now in terms of sugar, I'm trying to still figure that out, and I don't know. In terms of that, it's like that's the only time when you would get an answer where it's like, oh, potentially not bad in some situations, maybe.
right,
Like,
right. Like the kind of general trends of what people know they're doing right or wrong. Like people know if their diet is good or bad, right? And they also, the other implication is, well, if we have a higher concentration of obesity in these areas and not in these areas, and it's down to education, then it's solely down to like these people are dumb and these people know everything.
mm,
Whereas like not really. That they're probably that their nutritional knowledge is probably actually similar. So things like is sugar good or bad, or all the things we can teach people at a coaching level about nutrition, there's people in all classes across the spectrum that still are on the same level of, oh, I didn't know that maybe fat doesn't make you fat, or I
mm,
didn't know that you can have some sugar in your diet. All the things we teach them about calories, like
yeah,
their knowledge is probably relatively equal in that
mm,
area, I guess. Um,
mm.
so yeah, I just don't think that's the, to me that doesn't seem like the solution, and
No,
it's
I don't
probably
know.
not scalable either. You know,
Yeah, I
um,
definitely agree. It's like so. I'd just like to say thank you guys very much for listening. I hope you listened to both parts. So I hope you've actually listened to part one. Because part one we just talked about more sort of the stuff around the podcast. Because Danny is one of the, I would say, the best fitness podcasters really out there. So I really highly recommend you go check out his stuff. Sigma Nutrition Radio. So SIGMA Nutrition Radio. Very, very good podcast. Hopefully I don't convert too many of my listeners here. But yeah, thank you guys very, very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this sort of two-part episode. And feel free to let me know what you thought. You can contact me on Instagram at James Walsham, or you can contact me on Instagram at the Hypertrophy Hub. So, this is going to be a 2-part episode, which I've never done before. It's just because these are two vastly different conversations. That was a conversation sort of around conversations around a lot of things. This conversation really blew my mind. And what came next seriously blew my mind as well. I don't know whether to leave it on a cliffhanger or not. We talk around sort of keto, obesity, diabetes, sugar, etc. A lot of really interesting things around that. So just a really fucking good conversation that's coming up next. And the conversation that we had off air, I'm putting at the end of this discussion with Danny's permission, although some bits are taken out just for confidentiality, etc. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed part 1 of the Danny Lennon. I mean, maybe not a collaboration, but of Danny Lennon on the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you did too. But yeah, thank you guys very much for listening. The next episode should be out within the next 2 to 3 days. Yeah, cool. Thank you guys very much for watching.